So, welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. We have begun looking at the book of Ruth. We began with a survey of the Old Testament, and we have been looking through the entire Old Testament. And now we have arrived at the book of Ruth, and we just decided to slow down a little bit and go through the book of Ruth verse by verse, beginning in Ruth chapter 1. Now, we don't know the setting much about the book of Ruth beyond what it tells us here in the first verse. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." Now, one commentator believed that the book of Ruth took place during the time of the judge Gideon. But in reality, we cannot know specifically when the events of Ruth took place, other than the note here that it took place during the time of the judges. The famine that is listed here, famine in the land, famines in this part of the world were not uncommon and were caused by several different reasons. I mean, plant disease, lack of rain, insect infestation, and warfare is actually listed a couple of times in the Old Testament as causing famine. Famines actually in Genesis 12, in Genesis 26, Genesis 43, cause the ancestors, the patriarchs of the nation of Israel, to leave their areas. Abraham went to Egypt because of a famine. Isaac went to Gerar because of a famine. Jacob's family ended up going down to Egypt again because of this. And it says they left Bethlehem, Bethlehem meaning house of bread. So the house of bread for them, the house of supply, failed to supply the bread that the family needed. So they go over to Moab. And Moab, enemy of Israel, especially in this time, that was directly across the Jordan and the Dead Sea from Bethlehem, in the region where the tribes of Gad and Reuben had previously settled. Moab's position to the east of the Dead Sea meant that it often did not encounter the severity of a famine, or even possibly any parts of the famine at all. And so Elimelech and his family may have only traveled a few days from their home in Bethlehem into Moab territory. But it still remains that they left their homeland, which had been gifted to them by the Lord, and went to live among their enemies. So rather than call on the name of the Lord for the lifting of the famine, as is indicated in Deuteronomy chapter 30 as something they were supposed to do, Elimelech solves the problem using his own mind of the famine in his own way by leaving Bethlehem. And so verse 2, "The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there." And so they were from Bethlehem, obviously. They were Ephrathites. Now, Ephrath was an ancient name for the region that was around Bethlehem. It's actually referenced also in Genesis 35. And so they leave their region and they go into Moab. Look at verses 3 through 5. "But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman, Ruth, was left without her 2 sons and her husband." So she's going through a difficult time. It's interesting, the text here doesn't specify or doesn't specifically say when each of these men died. We just know they were there for 10 years, and all we can tell is at some point during that 10-year period, Naomi was living in Moab. Her husband dies, and both of her sons die. They could have been married for several years, the sons with Orpah and Ruth. But the absence of children is telling, especially in light of Ruth chapter 4, where it says the Lord gave her conception. So the Lord allowed her to get pregnant at that point. And so that verse, Ruth 4:13, it seems to imply that she was prevented from getting pregnant in her previous marriage. It's also revealing of the spiritual nature of the family that the two sons married women from an unbelieving enemy nation. Now, the law doesn't tell the Israelites, the law does tell the Israelites not to marry Canaanites in Deuteronomy 7:3, but it does not specifically prohibit marrying Moabites. However, the law also doesn't prohibit marriage to lots of other nationalities. The issue in Scripture, it's not the ancestry of the people that is the problem. The problem with marrying people of other nations was the idols that they worshipped. So the law does speak to that specifically by prohibiting marriage with people who worship idols in Deuteronomy 7. So the Moabite god was Chemosh, and he was worshipped in a very similar fashion to the Canaanite god Baal. And so though Israelites were not prohibited from marrying Moabite spouses, the Moabites were not allowed into the Israelite church services, nor were any children born from that union on into the 10th generation allowed into their church services either, from Deuteronomy 23. So the problem here is they leave behind God's instruction of involving themselves with unbelievers in their marriage union and go on in and marry Moabite women. Verse 6. This is Naomi after her husband's died and her sons have died. It says, she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and had given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. So when her husband dies, Naomi then would have been reliant upon her sons to provide for her food and finances. Then when her sons die, when her sons die, she would need to depend on extended family and tribal real estate, which she doesn't have in Moab. And so she hears about the end of the Bethlehemite famine, and it reaches her all the way over in Moab. She jumps at the possibility of going home to her family, or to her homeland, I should say. Verse 8. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So this is very unique here, special. Naomi offers a blessing to her former daughters-in-law that they would find peace, that they would find rest, and the Lord's kindness in finding new husbands. Now that's very interesting considering Naomi's thoughts later on in the passage. You see, here she very confidently says that the Lord is a possessor and giver of special kindness. She knows the Lord well. She trusts the Lord. And yet her experience with the brutality of the world led her to say that the Lord had dealt with less kindness to her than she's here praying for Orpah and Ruth. Notice also that Naomi is praying for the Lord to bless these two Moabite women whose culture and families and quite possibly themselves do not worship the Lord. She's praying that the Lord would bless them to find new husbands, new Moabite husbands, just in her care for them. It's very interesting that she goes that route here, but she's not thinking clearly, as we're going to come to see, because of her grief and her bitterness. Let's take a look at what happens next. Verse 10. And they said to her, so Orpah and Ruth, "No, we will return with you to your people." So this is a great statement of commitment on the part of the two daughters-in-law. They were prepared to leave everything they had known in favor of Naomi. But Naomi would not have it. Verse 11. But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Now, Naomi is describing something in her grief here. It's called a Levirate marriage. That's Latin for brother-in-law. It's from Deuteronomy chapter 25. It's when a brother would marry his brother's widow in order to bear a child to carry on the dead brother's family name. But it doesn't appear Naomi is mentioning this cultural thing as a legit possibility. She seems to be mentioning it, this cultural condition, to emphasize how little sense it makes for her daughters-in-law to stay loyal to her. She appears to be responding to their love with such harshness, really because of her grief. They had originally come to Moab for refuge, Naomi and Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion. They had come for refuge, come for safety, only to find death waiting for them. And so Naomi, again in her grief, she speaks of the Lord. She speaks of the Lord here being against her, as though he has her worst interest at heart, when in fact God was going to use Naomi to bless Ruth by placing her in the lineage of the Messiah. In addition, Naomi's going to help raise Ruth's sons Obed, who would be ancestor of the Messiah and grandfather to the great King David. You see, Naomi's temporary, limited perspective resulted in her brief, bitter response. Look at verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Now, it's easy to compare Orpah and Ruth, but Orpah should not be thought of as low, and while we take Ruth and venerate her because of each of their individual decisions, we have to remember that previously Orpah was just as prepared to go with Naomi as Ruth was. And it was only after Naomi's insistence that Orpah returns home. She submits to Naomi's insistence, Orpah does. And even still, Ruth's dedication and faith has to be commended because she defied Naomi to stay with her. Orpah submitted after insistence, but Ruth defied Naomi. Ruth stayed with Naomi because of her faith, because of her loyalty and dedication. Let's take a look. Verse 15. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do to me, and more so, or more also, if anything but death parts me from you." This incredible statement from Ruth is beyond what we can really grasp the full capacity of in our modern culture. You see, because Ruth, she's abandoning her family, and she's diving into an adoption of Naomi as her new family. It was unheard of in ancient cultures. It would have been the ultimate sign of dishonor, but Ruth was more than willing to follow Naomi and the one true God into this unknown future. And so it's worth recognizing that Ruth invokes the name of the Lord in verse 17. She says Yahweh. So her faith is burgeoning, and she's putting everything on the line for it. She's stepping out in this incredible faith. And even in the midst of that, if you look there in verse 15, Naomi, the supposed believer in the one true God, tells Ruth to return to Moab and to her gods. She tells Ruth to go back to her fake gods. So Naomi's really in a bad way here. She's really struggling in her grief, struggling in her bitterness, which is understandable to a point. But in the midst of the moment, she is being swallowed up by it. Look at verse 18. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Ruth decided to turn her back on her pagan family and their pagan gods, and she decided to declare loyalty to the people of Israel and faith in the God of Israel. Ruth had been severely influenced by her mother-in-law, despite the fact that she had, in her bitter grief, tried to turn Ruth away. Look at verse 19. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" So they get back to Bethlehem. And now most ancient Israelite villages were occupied by a few hundred people, with some notable exceptions. And similar to modern small towns, rumor and gossip undoubtedly ran rampant. So when Naomi returns without her husband and sons, there would have been a whole lot of talk about her and what had happened. And not only did she come back without them, she come back with a Moabite, the enemy of Israel. And something undoubtedly and markedly had changed in Naomi that made everyone there question if this was really her. I mean, it's been 10 years, so she's aged 10 years, but in the midst of that, also losing her husband and 2 sons and dealing with the grief and struggle and having to return home, it could have been something about her appearance that had changed. It could have been something simply about her countenance that it had changed, or it could have just been the fact that she was returning without her husband and sons. Or what I believe is it's probably a combination of everything. And they're saying, is this really Naomi? Could this really be Naomi who has come home after having been gone for so long? Verse 20. She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" Now, the name Naomi traditionally means sweet and pleasant, but she didn't think that those conditions applied to her anymore. Her grief led her to blame God for her situation. Her emotional state dulled her reason and her faith to the point that she accused God of ruining her life. Now, she still has faith. She still follows the Lord, but she's quite upset. Her emotions at the moment had more control over her life than did her faith. And she is of such a state that she says that she has returned home empty, even though she's returning home with Ruth by her side. Now, if you're Ruth, how do you think that makes you feel? Naomi's there. They're saying, "Is this really Naomi?" And Naomi's response was, "I've returned home empty." And here's Ruth standing next to her saying, "Well, then what am I?" I mean, but as we're going to come to see, Ruth has such phenomenal faith that she is not shaken by any of this. Verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. You see, Naomi, one of the commentators said it like this. He said, Naomi had left Bethlehem because of a food famine, and she returned with a famine in her soul. You know, it's worth noting the verb returned is used 12 times in this chapter, 12 times. 12 is a significant number in Scripture. And they returned at the time of the barley harvest. Barley harvest was usually a full month before the wheat harvest in mid to late April. And because of the early harvest, it was used in the first fruits offering and was a sign of the further harvest to come. So accordingly, it was a time of great celebration. It's a harvest time. It's the first fruits offering. And so even though they're returning home with Naomi's bitterness, with Naomi's grief, Ruth chapter 1 ends with great hope and with great harvest, that leading right on into chapter 2 and demonstrating Ruth's faith and the reemergence of Naomi's faith. So we're going to examine Ruth chapter 2 next week. So come back and check it out as we continue to examine in our Wednesday night study the Lord's work in the book of Ruth.